Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving up time today to join us for the second stakeholder reference group. This is a live question and answer, and today's topic is the Green Book and the appraisal process and the site review. We did run a session yesterday, and for those of you who haven't joined a session before, you're very, very welcome. If you would like to join more of these sessions or to hear from us directly into your inbox, please consider joining up to the stakeholder reference group. My name is Louise Halfpenny and I'm the Director of Communications, and we're going to be using Zoom, as you know, and what we'd like to do with the questions is for you to submit them via the chat function to me, Louise Halfpenny, and then I will put those questions to our panel. So onto the panel, let's just see who we've got with us today. We have Helen Brown, who is our Deputy Chief Executive. The slides are just going to catch up with me any minute now. I think they're feeling the heat. Dwayne Passman, Acute Redevelopment Programme Director, and Esther Moores, who's the Associate Director of Strategy. So we won't do much in the way of a recap today because I think the questions will really get us moving along quite nicely. So because we had some questions yesterday, I'm going to get going with one of the questions that we had in, which was about the long list. So this is a little bit different this year, and I'm going to ask Helen to describe the long list, what it is and when we might see it and be able to share it with you. So Helen, are you all right to take that topic?
Yeah, I'll try, and hopefully people have had a chance to watch the pre-recorded presentation that we published last week, because we did talk the Green Book and the process from long list to short list through in that presentation. But the key thing to talk about really first is the long list generator and the 5 headings that are set out in the Green Book that give you guidance as to how to develop that. And they cover a range of issues, including the scope, the service delivery configuration, and the delivery model for implementation and funding. So we have looked at that and seen how it would apply to our context and the proposals that we're taking forward, and set out a number of options under each of those headings that look at the scope of the investment, and these tie back to our critical success factors and investment objectives that we talked about earlier in the summer. We've looked at the potential site options. We've looked at potential estate options insofar as saying, are we looking for a 15-year lifespan, a 30-year lifespan, or a 60-year lifespan? And this is in line with the approach set out in the Green Book, which is helping you start with an absolutely huge range of potential options and start to narrow it down to say, where are we going to focus this programme of work and this investment? So the process that we go through next is to look at each of those domains and each of those options within each domain, and then RAG rate them. So we take some evidence, we look at it, and we have a discussion within the programme team and with some key partners, and we say, okay, of these options, which ones do we think is potentially the best option? Which is an option that meets the pass-fail kind of process for the critical success factors, and are there any options or any domains within that that don't meet the pass-fail criteria? And when we get through the end of that process, what it gives us is a clear kind of framework within which to then say in more detail, specifically, that gives us these potential estate solutions that we could take forward. So it is a little bit different because we didn't use the long list generator at strategic outline case stage, either in 2017 or in 2019. But we do need to use it for the outline business case. And it's very clear in our conversations with NHS England and the Department of Health that they expect us to use this approach. So that's what we will be doing. We then, from that piece, can crystallise a set of options for the shortlist. So you won't necessarily see a specific list of long list estates options that then we cross a few off and get to a short list. What you see is the generator that then helps us frame a shorter list of options. I'll just say a couple of quick things about the shortlist and the expectations of the Green Book and the regulators, and potentially also just reference quickly the letter that we published from regulators. But the shortlist must include something called the business as usual option. So that's really a comparator against which you compare any investment. And for us, the business as usual option in total costs just less than £100 million. And it is to do all the essential repairs and backlog maintenance on our existing buildings, plus develop some additional capacity for future demand. So that must be in the shortlist. We also have to have something called a do minimum option in the shortlist. And that is really the minimum capital investment to deliver your priority investment objectives. And for us, we've said the priority is around emergency care and getting all of our buildings to a condition B as a minimum. So the do minimum option sets out how you would do that. Because obviously this does build on the strategic outline case, our do minimum option will be the 2019 SOC preferred way forward, which is the £350 million option, 400 million if you include inflation. It redevelops emergency care on the Watford site with a large new block, but retaining the current main clinical Princess Michael of Kent block. And it also invests in improving facilities at St Albans and Hemel Hempstead Hospital. So that will be our do minimum. In addition to that, we are expected to include a minimum of 2 additional options on the shortlist, and probably a maximum of 3, or definitely a maximum of 4, because the whole point of a shortlist is to really focus in detailed work and detailed appraisal on truly viable and good options to take forward. And the more options you have in the shortlist, the less detail and the less good a job effectively you can do in the work to then identify your preferred option. And it won't really be until we've done the long list generator and we're in that process of defining the shortlist, and even through some of the first stages of the shortlist appraisal, that we really drill into the detail of exactly what a redevelopment option at Watford would look like, and exactly what a more extensive redevelopment might look like. And I know that, the new hospital on a new site, if that's in the shortlist, then we define really clearly what we meant by that and how that would look, and we'd need to be really clear which site we were looking at. So that is a long answer to a quick question, but hopefully it gives a bit of an overview of the whole long list to short list appraisal process.
Thank you, Helen. And could I ask you a little bit more just about the timescales? So you've talked us through the process. You slipped in a bit of jargon, which was RAG rating. So maybe if you could just untangle that for us and just remind us of the timescale, that would be great.
Yeah. Okay, so RAG rating is red, amber, green. So basically, a red rating means it doesn't pass the critical success factors, and that dimension on the long list generator would then be excluded. A green rating means that it absolutely meets the criteria and is either our preferred option or a very strong way forward. And amber suggests that it does meet the critical success factors, but it may be considered to be slightly less favourable for a range of reasons. And when we've done that piece of work, you can see we'll have a sort of traffic lighted long list generator from which we can then generate the short list of options. In terms of timeline, we are aiming to approve our shortlist of options at our October board meeting. So that's the 1st of October. We will be meeting jointly with the Herts Valley CCG board. So our 2 boards will meet in common, that's described, rather than actually a joint board. We'll both take separate decisions, but we'll discuss collectively the information presented. And we expect to publish early in September or early mid-September are proposed, the outcome of our rating assessment of the long list generator and our proposed shortlist, and there will be an opportunity for SRG members to engage with that, give us their views and their comments, that we will then make sure that the board understands the wide range of views that people will have about the shortlist as we put it together. From there, so we are very focused at the moment on shortlist, but the equally important or very important milestone after that is for our February board to identify the preferred option, and then we get into the really detailed design and implementation planning for the preferred option. So October, a really important milestone. September will be an important month in terms of sharing with stakeholders the work that we've done and getting their views, and then lots of work through to Christmas to do the detail on the shortlist.
Thank you. Dwayne, I'd like to come to you if I may. It's a question that lots of people have been asking. You might not be able to answer it, but you can explain possibly why. Is there going to be a clear site, so a new site on the shortlist?
Thank you very much, Louise. And first of all, hello to everyone that I've not met. And I know that many of you have been engaged in this discussion for some years. My name's Dwayne Passman. I'm the new Acute Hospital Redevelopment Director, and I started here about 3 weeks ago. So forgive me, I'm still catching up a little bit, still getting my feet under the table, but hopefully I can give you an idea of the answer to that question. So what we're looking at the moment, I think as Helen has outlined, is we've engaged Royal Free Property Services and Montague Evans to give us an independent review of not only external sites that have been identified for the potential for the rebuilding of emergency hospital, but also what the site options are at Watford. So we will be receiving that report over this week, and we will publish it as soon as we've checked it for factual accuracy. And what I'm going to be really, really clear about here is we're not going to rewrite that report or interfere with it in any way. What we are going to do is just check it for factual accuracy and for typos and stuff like that before it is published formally. And that's a really, really important point. So that will inform how we then look at the long list. And hopefully, as you've seen from the presentation that we uploaded for SRG last week, is that a new greenfield site for the emergency hospital is a part of that long listing process. Now, we will use that report to inform our views as we move from long list to short list. Now, that does not necessarily mean that we'll be costing everything in absolute detail. What it does look at is those critical success factors and investment objectives that we've set out, that we've received feedback on, and we will use those, as Helen said, as a red, amber, green filter to see what is deliverable against all those critical success factors and investment objectives. And that will take us down to a short list of between 4 and 6 options. Any more than that, and it isn't a short list, frankly, for further development. So to answer the question, absolutely, I'm giving a little bit more context there, but to answer that question, absolutely, we will be using the report that's coming to us this week to review our options and to see whether there is a clearly deliverable, plausible and rational new site on which we could deliver an emergency hospital.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. Thank you. Esther, can I come to you, please, to ask a question about planned and emergency care? We've previously talked about the separation, which is something that's set out in the NHS long-term plan. But I have a question here, which is, if new facilities were built, would it not be preferable that the emergency and planned care services were adjacent to prevent a duplication of expensive facilities? Is that one you want to pick up, Esther?
Yep, I'm happy to pick that one up. So I think there are a couple of key aspects to this. There's the what's right clinically, and then there's also practicality. So from a clinical perspective, talking to our frontline clinicians, they're really clear that there's a benefit in keeping a degree of separation between emergency and planned care. And the reason for that is that there's a risk always that emergency patients can, their care is needed immediately, and as a result, it could mean that then patients whose operations are planned, they're not necessarily as immediately urgent, could then find their operations cancelled. So our clinicians are really clear that there's a benefit of keeping a degree of separation. And as I'm sure everyone will be aware, when it comes to practicality, there are different ways that you can keep that separation. At the moment, of course, we do have our planned care on St Albans and Hemel sites primarily. For more complex patients and procedures that are planned, we do see those patients at Watford. We do have a degree of planned outpatient sort of care at Watford. So there are benefits of keeping a degree of separation. To put them all together on one site, well, other hospitals do that. And to put everything all together on one site, obviously would then, we would need to have a look at the cost of that, as we have done in previous SOCs when we, strategic outline cases, when we've been looking at the options for our area for West Hertfordshire in general. And I think where we have generally come to as part of that decision making is it's really important that we sort emergency care out and that we get that right. And if we're in an environment where our funding is constrained, then we are of course prioritising where we think we need to invest right now for us as a health economy.
Thank you. Slight change of tack, and one for you, Helen, about a court case. So the judicial review, which is being heard at the end of October, surrounding previous preferred option. We expect there will be a decision around that. Would that affect our shortlist or long list process in any way?
My apologies, I'd gone on mute. So yes, we are in a live judicial review process, and as Louise says, we're expecting that case to be heard at the end of October. It did relate to the strategic outline case, and the judge who hears that case will obviously consider the merits of the appeal effectively by the campaign group, as well as the merits of the case presented by the CCG and the Trust. It's actually a judicial review primarily to the CCG in terms of their commissioning responsibilities and consultation, but we work together on this. So the Trust and the CCG's case, the judge will take a view on the specific issues as they related to the SOC stage and either find for or against the campaign group. Clearly, if they find against the campaign group, then we just proceed as is. If they accept the case made by the campaigners, the other thing that the judge then does is go on to say what they think should happen next, so what remedy might be required. So it is possible, although I don't personally believe it is likely, that the judge would say, yes, we find in favour of the campaign group, and we believe that a consultation should have happened around a new hospital site. And it is possible that they would then say that we should do one. And if they did say that, then that's what we would need to do. But it's equally possible that they don't find in favour of the campaign groups, or that even if they did, they don't require us to go back. And what they will bear in mind is the overall public kind of good, the urgency of any requirement to move forward, as well as the specific issues in question within the case. So we're just, I mean, our view is that we need to keep going. We have given a commitment to not make irreversible changes before that judicial review. But we are absolutely clear that we need to continue to make progress. We can't go on hold until the judicial review is heard. So we will cross that bridge when it comes, I think is my, in essence, my sum up of that. We will cross that bridge when it comes.
Thank you. Jane, I'd like to come to you, if I may, with a question about the site review. And we know now that the Watford site has been added to the 4 other sites. So that's 5 sites in total that are being reviewed. Are they being reviewed equally in terms of the 2025-26 deadline? Thank you.
Yes.
That was a good short answer, wasn't it? We did hear Helen talking about the deadline or the timescale yesterday, and the view that we gave yesterday, which is that we're working as fast as we can to make sure that we can bring new hospitals to our patients in 2025. But I think, Helen, you were saying that it's a very challenging timeline, and it may be that some are going to be a bit later. Perhaps, Dwayne, you want to just confirm that?
Any timeline for the redevelopment of a new hospital is challenging. This is the 8th major hospital development I've worked on. Some of them have gone very, very quickly. Some of them have gone less quickly. Depends at which point in the economic cycle you're at. It depends on the political will to make them happen. Where we seem to be in the economic and political cycle at the moment is the wind is in our sails for moving very, very quickly. And, you know, I do have some experience of this from 20 years ago when we had the NHS plan in 2000 and the investment plan in 2001, which looked to do 100 new hospital buildings by 2010. And so the political pressure was actually very, very strong to get those things done. If you didn't get those done in the timescale that you're allocated, you started to move further and further back towards the end of the queue. Now, I'm not saying for an instant, and please understand this, I'm not saying for an instant that that is the circumstance here, but it is a risk to all of us in terms of how quickly we can move forward with this. We do have the political wind in our wings, and therefore it's incumbent on the trust to catch that wind and to move as fast as we possibly can to achieve the maximum benefits we can, the optimal benefits we can, for the appropriate cost for the people of West Hertfordshire.
Great, thank you.
So can I just come in briefly, Louise?
Yes, of course.
Sorry, on that one. So I completely agree with everything that Dwayne's said. I think I would just add from a trust board perspective that, you know, we feel a real responsibility for making improvements to our estate infrastructure for our patients' benefit and for our staff, because we know that our current, I mean, on a hot day like today, you can imagine what it's like to be a patient in one of our wards and what it's like to be, you know, a hardworking nurse or porter or doctor in that environment. It's really not a good environment, and we know there are very many reasons that we set out in full in the strategic outline case about why it doesn't meet our needs. So yes, there's an expectation from the government that these schemes will deliver as close as possible to 2025 as they can, but equally there's a responsibility that the trust board feels to make this happen, a good solution, but as quickly as we can for the benefit of our staff and patients. So the conversations we've had with regulators is, if everything goes absolutely like clockwork, with one of the Watford redevelopment options, then we could just about hit 2025. It will be the very end of 2025, possibly early 2026, but there is a risk of it falling into 26. Clearly, other options might take a bit longer, and one of the things that we're hoping that the site review piece of work will give us is a sense of likely timescales for the different options in terms of sites and the relative risks of those, so that we can make an informed judgment. But there won't be if you can't deliver by the 1st of January, or sorry, the 31st of December 2025, you're crossed off. But equally, if it's clear that it's going to take significantly longer, then that would be a really key consideration for us.
Thank you. And just to go back to you, Dwayne, with a question here for you with all of your experience. So you've come to this, you've come to us at West Herts with sort of fresh eyes. You don't have any of the history. You could look at all the documents and really kind of make your own mind up and bring your knowledge to our situation. Do you think that 2025-26 is a reasonable deadline, given all the things that we might want to do wherever we might be building?
2025-26 is not implausible. For a start, it usually for a hospital of this scale, wherever you build it, it will take three and a half-ish years for a building this big to be built. And that's experientially. It depends on the nature of the site. It depends on the nature of the infrastructure that you put into the site. Sometimes, and not in all cases, a greenfield site can be more difficult because you've got to put in roads and power and drainage and stuff like that. And you might have to take those quite away. So there's an increased cost in that and an increased time in that. Now, I'm not saying that's a complete barrier, and we'll look at that in terms of the site review report that we've got coming up for us. What I would say, and it's the point that I made in the presentation we made to SRG colleagues in the last week, is that if the way that the Treasury, the way that the Department of Health and our regulators will look at this, is they will say, okay, you're spending £1. What ratio of benefits to wider society will you get for that £1? So let's say for a moment we spend £1 and we get 8% of the benefits. But to do something else, to get 100% of the benefits, we've got to spend £2. Now, I think, as we all know, that's quite an easy equation to do. So you're actually spending twice as much to get that last 20% of benefits. And putting that in front of an objective appraisal, in front of the Treasury, if we went forward with something that said we're going to spend £2 for 100%, but we could spend £1 for 8%, the Treasury will tell you £1 for 8% every single time.
Thank you. So can we stick with the financial theme? Because I've got a question here, which is, what is the timescale for repayment of loans for capital redevelopment? So I don't know, Helen or Dwayne, if either of you want to take that question on. So timescale for the repayment of loans for capital development.
Okay, so this is quite a technical finance question. I'll have a quick duffers go, and if Dwayne wants to come in and supplement, then he's very welcome. It's not really a repayment concept. It is more like an interest-only mortgage, although even that's not quite right. So effectively, the Treasury will provide us with a sum of public dividend capital, be that 350, 400, 600 million. And then every year, we're expected to pay a dividend on that of 3.5% as it currently stands. And on top of that, we're expected obviously to maintain the asset, which we call it depreciation, and we're expected to invest that into the building. Now, the thing that I'm not au fait with, that Dwayne might do better, and if Don had been on the call, he would have answered, is there is obviously a complex set of accounting around the value of your assets and how that gets managed in your accounts over time. So we might have to revert to a written answer for that aspect. But Dwayne, have you got anything you wanted to add on that?
No, thank you, Helen. That's a great description, actually. As Helen said, it's not really quite as simple as, you know, you take a chunk of money a little bit like a mortgage, and then you pay off so many so many pounds every year in a really, really structured way until you've paid the whole thing off. Because it's an intragovernmental transfer, there can be a way of sculpting those loans over the years so that in the years when you're building the building, you're paying less back because you're not actually having any beneficial use of the building. And then it's weighted towards the back end when the building's operational and you can actually pay off some more loan. But that will be a subject of discussion for us when we look at the financial case, which is one of the 5 cases in the outline business case. And it will only really get bolted down finally when we come to the full business case, ultimately in 2021-22. And that will define the whole thing. And it does depend from scheme to scheme. So say, for example, if you were building a building, and I have done this before, whereby you're opening a new service or expanding a service, and NHS England, NHS Improvement are going to pay you more money to do that. That will help you because you're going to get extra income. That will help you pay off the loan quicker or ever so slightly quicker. So it just really, really depends on the individual circumstance of every individual scheme. But yes, at the end of the period, you will be expected to have paid off the mortgage, even though it isn't, as Helen says, quite like a loan mortgage. Yeah. It doesn't quite work like that, and it's one of those arcane pieces of finance that lots of accountants sit in a room and have fun about.
I think if Don was here, he says it's more like a dividend payment to a shareholder. So the government have invested X £100 million into West Herts. We're expected to pay them a dividend payment. And it's not even quite like that. So you can see that we're slightly struggling to describe it because it is really technical public sector finance rules. But effectively, we have to pay a charge related to the value of our assets, and that is to ask NHS organisations to use their assets carefully and to best effect, and that's why this is in place. So we have a responsibility to look after the buildings, but also to use them well and to not ask for more than we need. And that's really what it's trying to do. But it's not a loan, it's public dividend capital, it's slightly different.
And sticking with the money, can I ask how this will affect the funds that we have for staffing if there is this dividend payment?
Yeah, so there is a direct relationship between how much we spend on our buildings and how much we've got available to spend on our services. And the more we spend on our buildings, the less we have to spend on clinical service delivery. And if you take that, again, Dwayne can probably give you a quick back of the envelope guide to this, but for every square metre of building that you build new, it costs you a certain amount of money to do that, and you have to pay a dividend on it. So we know, because we shared some of these working at strategic outline case, that there is, it does depend on the option and how much we spend. So yes, there's a direct relationship. The more we spend on the buildings, the more we have to pay to maintain those buildings, look after them, and to cover the payments back to government, the less we've got available to spend on staff. Having said which, really good buildings, really well designed, can make a difference to how you deliver services and help you get efficiencies. So again, it's complicated, but we have to bear all of that in mind as we go through the next stage of the appraisal process. A
you. Sorry, Dwayne, it sounded like you were going to come in there.
No, I was just going to agree with Helen. Broadly speaking, as a rule of thumb, the cost of buildings is about 20%-ish of your overall total cost. Now, that's an average. And the more that you invest in the building, the more that proportion increases. But it doesn't increase hugely differently from that. So the way to make these things work is around staff efficiency. So let's say, for example, we've got 100 porters, but we only have 80 of them recruited. but we're still keeping 20 of them in our budget. We've never been able to recruit them. This is a generic example. This is not specific, just to be absolutely certain. And so what you would do is carry that 20% of portering in your budget. But with a more efficient building, porters are able to move around it much more efficiently and quickly. They don't have to push patients as far. They can spend more time with the patient. And it means that you might not need the full establishment of portering. And again, this is just an illustrative example. So the thing that you keep in your budget becomes a cost efficiency saving. So you would only need those 80 porters because actually that last 20% of porters you've never actually been able to recruit, and you've usually recruited on bank or agency and they're more expensive. So you're building your own in-house and growing your own people in-house to give you better efficiency and effectiveness based on the efficiency and effectiveness of the building.
Thank you. Apologies, I've got a police helicopter circling overhead where I'm dialing in from.
They know where you live, Louise.
I wanted to ask a question that's been sent in, which is about transport. We know from last year and years before, it's really dear to people's hearts. So Esther, could you possibly explain at what point we'll take a more detailed look at travel and access? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Louise. So I'll talk about access first and then about travel, because access means different things. So access to services means you can get to them readily at the point of real need, that you can get there quickly when you need to do so, but also, say, for planned care services, that we can organise how we deliver services as well as possible, so we're not asking people to come back repeatedly for an outpatient appointment, a diagnostic, come back for a review. So we are really looking at how we provide our services so that access can be as good as it possibly can be, but sometimes that might mean actually delivering care virtually, as has happened. We've made great strides in doing that as a result of COVID, and delivering care really, really differently. Then when it comes to transport, obviously whatever our preferred option is, then that's a real opportunity to look at transport, to work with the local authority to make sure that we have the improved transport access to our hospital sites. One of the issues I think that we have had fed back repeatedly when we've done public meetings before is that public transport between our existing sites is quite challenging. I think people have also raised the fact that if you've had a procedure, your mobility is different. Knowing what alternative routes are compared with the usual way that you would travel to hospital is a real challenge. So we're doing what we can to look at how we make services more one-stop shops, how we make sure that we're not asking people to travel time and time again if that's not necessary, when it comes to how people can actually get to our sites, when we know which way we're headed, to have those conversations with the local authority to be able to help and influence how public transport routes work, and make sure we've got good information so that we can support people if they're having to look at a different means of travelling to the hospital. Those are all things that we know that are going to be really important to people using the services.
Thank you. And you said the word COVID, which is never very far from any of our minds at the moment. And we have had a question about the lessons that we've learned from COVID. And I know you're working quite closely with our leading clinicians thinking through the clinical strategy, Esther. So would you be able to talk a little bit about how our experience is shaping our plans going forward?
Yep, sure. And obviously, as I'm sure people understand, this is quite a new and a current conversation that we're having within the Trust. So the implications of COVID are, of course, that where appropriate, we're doing much more virtually. So we are delivering care within people's homes. We're providing virtual consultations and remote monitoring of patients, so that our clinicians can have an understanding of how patients who've been discharged from hospital are doing. When it comes to the future design of the hospital, there are lots of things that we are looking at the moment, and we're also in dialogue with other trusts that are part of the first wave of hospitals to receive really significant investment, so that we can compare notes. We're looking at how you cohort services, so that you can create a sort of a real differentiation of care for, well, not care, differentiation of pathways through for patients who have COVID and those who don't. And we're looking at things like where might we want to build in donning and doffing areas for staff to have have PPE, so that those sort of things are part of a future hospital design, as opposed to things that we've had to think about as a result of this immediate pandemic. There's a really long list. I could give chapter and verse, and we're working through really systematically a whole range of ideas as to which ones of those do we want to make sure that we build into the new hospital design.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you. I think this is a question for you, Dwayne, because it's about it's imagining, and we can't know yet because we're not at this stage in the process, but if the preferred option was at the Watford site, how would we manage all that redevelopment whilst still running a hospital? I'm sure you've got plenty of experience to share on that.
Yes, indeed. And thank you for whoever asked that question. The majority of hospital developments that have been done in this country, in history, have been on existing sites. It's tough, it's difficult, but it is doable. So we look at, let's look at Barts and the London for a moment. The Royal London project was about 190,000 square metres of accommodation being built in 2 towers directly adjacent to the existing hospital. So the historic hospital, which I think I'm going to call Holland Wing, but if I've got that wrong, please forgive me, because it's been 12 years since I looked at it. And then on the other side, you had a 2-storey cruciform building, an old nuclear style building, which was paediatrics and neonatal intensive care. And the trust and the constructor, who was a firm called Skanska, constructed sound and dust barriers along those, and they were working, I don't know, it must have been 6 feet away to create the foundations for the new building and to build the new building from a neonatal intensive care unit. And neonates are some of the most sensitive in terms of sound disruption that you can get in any patient group. So I was fascinated to go and see how they'd done that. And it was extra tall hoardings and sound attenuation between them. And I actually spoke to the staff in the neonatal intensive care unit, and throughout that whole process of digging down, I don't know, they must have gone down about 20 metres to create the basements for the new building. And then when they were constructing the structure, no complaints at all, either in dust, vibration, or noise. And so it is entirely possible to do this. And my own recent experience on a very, very constrained site in a trust in the south of England is it is possible to build a very, very large building within metres of existing buildings. It's hard work. Key to it is communication, keeping very, very careful attention to dust, vibration and noise, which we did do on a daily basis, and ensuring that we had good communications with the occupants of those buildings. So if there was going to be a noisy activity, like putting in the piles for the building, or certainly in the excavation, then we would tell the occupants of those buildings very, very clearly when the peak times are going to be and what the impact would be to them and to local residents as well. And that, with anything that happens on an existing hospital site, communication is absolutely key, both to patients, visitors, staff, and local residents. And certainly my last experience taught me that very, 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 very clearly. If you can let people know what's going to happen before it happens, they're ready for it.
Thank you. And although we can't prejudge the appraisal here, we have been asked about this site. So do you think on a site this size, it is possible to, we've talked about building in a slightly phased way, where you build new, move into it, build new, move into it and demolish behind. Is that the sort of thing that can be done so that you're not actively building around patients where they are?
Yeah, yes, I mean, every site is different because you've got different things in place where you want to go. When I first went to Brighton in 2007, and it wasn't for the job interview or anything else, it was, strangely enough, I was invited by the architects to go and see the new children's hospital, which was a PFI on the site, because I'd worked with that firm of architects before. And I stood on the 10th floor, which was 15 stories above ground because of the slope of the site. And I looked down at the hospital site, well, at the site in front of me. And I said, "What's all this, Tat?" And they said, "Oh, that's the hospital." I said, No. Big white tower block over there to the east of where I was stood. That's a hospital. We're in a hospital building here. There's something that looks like a hospital behind me. But what's all this 2- and 3-story stuff in front of me? And they said, "No, that's the existing hospital, including the original one from 1828. And I went, "Oh, Lord, that's appalling," because it was dreadful. So I said, "Well, what are you planning to do with all this then?" And they said, "Oh, eventually we'll get round to redeveloping it." And at the time I said, "Well, I pity the poor individual who has to do it." Bizarrely, a year later, I was the individual to do it. And I did find a way, and everyone had told me right from the beginning, it wasn't doable. And we found a way of doing it. The first phase of that development is on site and is within 18 months of completion. So it's doable with the will.
Thank you, Dwayne. And you make a point about every scheme being different. So we have been asked about, how do you think a hospital can be developed here on an existing site when it's taking so much longer in Brighton? And I know in our frequently asked questions, we've given answers to questions like this, because they are asked, but every site is so different. I mean, do you have a view on making comparisons, Dwayne?
It is really, really difficult to make those comparisons directly, because every site is different. The services that you've got to relocate to start building are always incredibly different. I don't think I've seen, and this is over 30 years, I don't think I've seen any site that's the same when it comes to that. And I'm thinking that through quite carefully. I'm not doing a snap answer to that. So yeah, they're all entirely different. And sometimes clearing that site takes more money, more time. Sometimes it takes less. But none of it's undoable. Either on a new site or an existing site. It's not impossible to do it on an existing site. I was told Royal Sussex County Hospital in Brighton was the impossible site. Well, it wasn't. And, you know, if you can do that, a colleague of mine did Bartson London and managed to clear that site, ready for the redevelopment at the Royal London site in Whitechapel. I think if either of those two can be done, anything can be done.
Excellent. Okay, Helen, we're going to come to you with a question now, which is about the Watford site and competitive bidding, because at the Watford site we have the involvement of Kia, and the question is, how can the Trust be assured that the competitive bidding process will get best value if the Watford site is chosen, because Kia has a stake, and that could influence other potential bidders, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and I might ask Dwayne to talk about the procurement process, but and we have answered questions along these lines in the past. So to be clear, our relationship with Kia does not require us to work with them for our hospital redevelopment. We can, we do sometimes work with Kia on some of our smaller schemes, but we work with many contractors and we don't have any legal obligation to do it. In terms of how it might be perceived when we go to the market for a construction partner to work with us, we will work really, really hard to make sure that we get the best available pool of bidders to work with us to build the hospital through a full engagement and dialogue process. But they're used to, those large construction firms are used to these kind of processes, and it is absolutely our commitment to do a full and appropriate market testing process, probably using a framework, and there are many frameworks that exist, but some key ones that we can use. That is the process we will use, and we will make sure that we spend the time with the key partners to get the best possible range of bids and get the best construction firm to work with us.
Thank you. And this is possibly for you also, Helen, and Dwayne might want to come in, but it's about lifespans. So if we're planning to cater for capacity for up until 2035, does that mean that we're going to start adding on looking to start building to add on another 10 years, or how does that that longer term planning work for planned and emergency care?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Helen.
I'll answer quickly the first bit around what's the right size for the hospital in the future, and then Dwayne can pick up in terms of how we think about that from a design construction point of view. And Esther, obviously also feel free to come in. And when we talked about this yesterday, and we talk about it in the programme team, we're all really clear that we don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know exactly what the future is going to look like. But there's an established kind of approach to looking about what do we deliver currently, and what's the size of our population, how much activity are we doing at quite a detailed level, so at specialty and subspecialty level. How do we expect that to change over time? That's obviously linked to changes in the population. Is it growing? Is there new housing? Is the demographic profile changing? More younger people, more older people? We also look at historic trends in terms of how health service use changes. So A&E attendances have historically gone up over the past many years. We project that forward, but we always also look at changes where we think trends might go the opposite direction, or where clinical practice might mean that a hospital admission's no longer required, or where we used to do inpatient surgery, we might do day surgery instead. So there's lots of work that goes into trying to get our best view of what the future hospital needs to do in terms of what needs it's going to meet and how we're going to do it. We are working to, and part of that is also the relationship with community and primary care and what happens out of hospital. So all of that, we did it at SOC stage, we're reviewing and updating it now. We are working to 2035 in terms of doing that in as much detail as we can. Post 2035, we did this in the SOC, we did model forward, but effectively we say that any changes in demand upwards are offset by new models of care downwards. So in reality, we'd built in growth to enable us to have a bigger hospital to 2035. After that date, it just becomes too difficult to predict. but we do need to build flexibility. And since I'm going particularly cough now, I'm going to pass over to Dwayne to say, well, how do we work with that from a estate perspective?
There's a number of different ways we can look at this. I'm reminded that in the early 1990s, and I'm sorry I keep harping back to history, but unless you know where you come from, it's quite difficult to see where you're going. And there was a very, very serious academic paper done in the, I think it was mid-1990s, by a researcher called Vetter. And he predicted, with his colleagues, that based on the usage of NHS beds, that by the year 2035, strangely and by coincidence, the last NHS single bed in the UK would close, having put 24 million patients through it in a day. If you carried those trends forward, I mean, that's frankly implausible. And that was the purpose of the exercise of him doing it, saying if you keep forcing trends like that, you will get to a daft place. So what we have the opportunity to do, not only through the business case process, but through the process that we have every year with our commissioners, is to review what activity we have based on the demographics of our population, and then see where is the most appropriate place for that care to be undertaken, whether that's in primary care, community care, or acute. Now, 90% of our patients come from the emergency work stream, broadly speaking. So unless we can cut down on all that side of things, we are always going to have a bed base. Now, how that bed base changes over time will be to do with population and demographics. But what we do need to do is track those changes, and also where there can be greater interventions in plant care, because that's where I think things are going to change most dramatically over the next 10 years, given the experience we've had with COVID and the number of outpatient appointments that can now be done by video conferencing, which we've tried to do in the NHS for 20 years. And suddenly, within 6 months, we've gone from 100% of all our outpatient appointments being done face-to-face to 60% in 6 months. I mean, that's incredible. And those sort of trends are going to continue over time. So when we look at 2035, with the scale of the hospital that we are planning, yes, there might be some spare capacity in there between now, or between 2025 and 2035, but also there'll be changing models of care within that period of time as well. So within the existing block that we've got, if activity comes down because of demography, because of technology, because of different treatments, then one of the things we could look at, so that we're not wasting space, is we might want to look at something like increasing the number of single rooms in there. So if you've got a 4-bed patient bay, you'd take out a 4-bed patient bay and put 2 single rooms in, so you'd lose 2 beds across the whole hospital. So that's one thing you could look at it. So greater patient amenity within the space that's available. The second thing is around master planning the hospital and leaving us enough flexibility within the structure of the building, but also adjacent to the structure of the building, whichever building we build in up to 2025, to make sure that if we did need to expand for whatever reason, then we do have the capability and the flexibility to do that if the decision was taken at the time, in 10, 15 years' time, that either the hospital needed to expand or other services were being brought to the hospital for which we needed a new block. So it's all about looking at the options, giving us enough flexibility around any particular development site to make sure that we're future-proofed.
Great. Well, that's good. 1549 ends with a nice strong point about looking to the future. So thank you very much, Dwayne, and thank you for everyone. Before we sign off, I would like to remind you that we're putting as much information on our website as we possibly can. We did do one of these sessions yesterday, and some of the questions were slightly different, as you would expect. So if you want to, you could view yesterday's session, but we will also take all of the questions and put them into an FAQ. These do take a bit of a while to pull together, but we are working on the second one already. And just wanted to say thank you for joining us. We will be in touch again soon. As you know, there's a lot of important process coming our way, and we want to have you with us as we get through to shortlist and then into the future. So thank you again for giving up your time this afternoon.